first thing I want to do is just sort of orient ourselves. This is part of what has been a semester-long program called Democracy Executed, put on by the Social Sciences Division. It began this lecture series with a talk by a geographer in environmental policy. It continued with a historian and economist talking about the historical costs of maybe, where's the word, kicking out immigrants. What has been the historical role of immigration to our economy? A couple of weeks ago, we talked about the history of social protest movements. This is the penultimate event of the lecture series. It's going to be a talk from the lens of philosophy with Dr. Katie Howard from Cal State LA. She's assistant professor there, got her doctorate from Emory University. Her work looks at, one, the role of emotions, how the emotions factor into decision making. She's working, among other things, she's written a work called White Femininity and Conspicuous Shame. She also is into political theory, feminist political theory, and I believe your work is a reader on the place of the witch in politics. So
witches room. Okay.
So if you're interested in witchcraft, she's a good person to talk to. On furthest right is your left is Theo Morgan Arnold. He graduated from UCLA after coming through here with a degree in philosophy. Graduated a year or two ago from Cal State LA. He's lectured at UCLA. He's lectured at LA Harbor. He teaches philosophy and humanities classes here. He's teaching a humanities class this fall, and then next spring, if you're interested in some of the issues we're talking about here, he's teaching a class on social and political philosophy. So, and I'm Kevin Mack. I teach philosophy and history. We don't have nearly enough time to cover everything, but there will be a sort of like a 30-minute and upstairs in SR 321, where there will be photos, conversation to be asked. We can continue the conversation up there. So our general plan, we have about 60 minutes. The idea is that we will talk about 30 to 40 minutes, talking about kind of the philosophically important issues that are raised with the recent Trump administration. I want to emphasize this isn't going to be a partisan talk. I don't want to get into the business of attacking one individual or one political party. Instead, I want to sort of look at it from a more neutral lens. And when this was coming up, Katie, Theo, and I thought, Arendt, and I'll introduce her in a second, Arendt's work raises really lots of interesting issues about civil disobedience, what is legality, what is morality. So I think she offers us a really nice entryway into engaging with some of these issues. So the idea is we talk, 30 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to you for a Q&A for about 30 minutes, because we're just as interested in sort of the issues that you students are sort of wondering about than the things we just came up with. Okay, so let's begin with Katie. Who is Hannah Arendt, and why should we care?
Well, so first of all, thank you for having me. GCC, thank you for inviting me. As Kevin said, I'm, currently working on stuff on emotion, on witches, on race, and gender and things like that. I started my career working on Arendt, who's a 20th century German Jewish philosopher, political theorist. She fled Nazi Germany right in the 1930s, as many intellectuals of her generation did. And she ended up, by way of a few other places in New York in, I think, 1941, I want to say. Right? And she was stateless for like 10 or 12 years and then finally got US citizenship in 1950. And so Arendt is, trained as a philosopher, but one thing that I love about her story and about her work is that because I have my own sort of weird relationship with philosophy, she actually sort of turned away from philosophy and toward political theory. Having to do with reasons of what was going on in Europe at the time and the sort of complicity of European philosophers with the rise of totalitarianism, things like that. And she also just became a lot more interested in the role of history, the impact of political and social issues on our ways of thinking, right? So that's Arendt. I'm happy to talk more about she has a very interesting, controversial backstory that we can talk more about. Why should we care about Arendt? It's such a good question. Thank you for giving me the chance to talk about it. Like I said, I started my career working on Arendt. I wrote my doctoral dissertation on Arendt. And for many people who get to that stage and spend like 5 or 6 years writing a dissertation, it's very exciting to no longer think about any of that ever again. And so that was fully my intention. And just recently, I'll give you a little anecdote. I was at a meeting of an organization called PSWIP, which is the Society for Women in Philosophy, the Pacific Division. So it's like a group that I'm engaged with. And I met this other philosopher, and she asked me, "Oh, what you work on?" And I gave her, sort of the spiel about emotion and stuff like that, the stuff that I'm interested in these days. And then I said, but I've spent most of my time working on Arendt. And she was like, "Oh, yeah. Well, you can't stop doing that now, can you?" Right? Because there's a sense in which I keep trying to move away from Arendt, work on different things. But there's a way that her work and her thinking has only become more relevant and more urgent. So I've tried to get away. I can't really get away from it. And that's because Arendt is really notable for how perceptive she is about some of the most dangerous problems and perplexities of modern social political life, right? And so things like, she basically wrote the book on totalitarianism, put it that way, right? She's the foremost thinker of totalitarianism. She herself was an immigrant and thinks a lot about the refugee crisis, and the plight of immigrants and the harms of assimilation, things like that. She has this very interesting critique of Zionism from a Jewish perspective. And she's really interested in political evil. What is the nature of evil? And what are our responsibilities as citizens living in the midst of, evil? That might be a strong word. Let's say criminality. We can also say injustice, right? What are the responsibilities of ordinary people sort of living in an unjust society, right? She's very interested in that. And so, of course, a lot of people are reading Arendt right now. Her most notable book, her first book in the English language, Origins of Totalitarianism, which she published in 1951, recently sold out on Amazon, right? Because people are really returning to her work in ways that are exciting, and also just diagnostic of the times that we're living. So lots of reasons to care. And I'll plug this book by a prominent Arendt scholar, Dick Bernstein, who was a teacher of mine. And he has this lovely short little book called Why Read Hannah Arendt Now, which is very readable, very accessible for people new to the study of Arendt. So I'll just plug that. I take a lot of my reading of Arendt from Bernstein. So I'll cite my sources, as we all must.
All right, to start us off, I wanted to ask you first about the relationship between law and morality. So a lot of us, when we're younger, maybe we're taught that a big part of being moral, or maybe most of being moral, is following the laws of the land. Maybe laws. Maybe, how does Arendt think about the relationship between law and morality? Do they ever diverge? Are they ever in line? What's the relationship?
Okay. Very good question, very hard question. And you guys are going to jump in on some of this.
Well, we're jumping in.
Okay. So, yeah, what's the relationship between law and morality? Well, I think that Arendt acknowledges that in most of our political experience, they tend to overlap, right? In the vast majority of cases, we think that the laws that those two terms also have an interesting relationship, morality and justice, right? But they tend to overlap. Do they always? No. And history is sort of riddled with examples of cases where morality and legality do not overlap. And we'll probably talk about some of those cases a little bit later. I know that, Kevin and I were talking last week about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who explicitly says in Letter from Birmingham Jail that there are just laws and unjust laws. To make those distinctions. Theo, you just referenced, you said, what's the relationship between law and morality? And you sort of said law of different kinds, morality of different kinds. That's part of the difficulty, right? Is that we have positive law, which is sort of the law of the land. We have conceptions of natural law. We have conceptions of divine law. And then on the side of morality, we have conceptions of transcendental morality, right? These moral principles that exist above and outside of everyday life that are supposed to inform our conduct and decisions. The problem that Arendt talks about quite a lot and that she was really trying to confront in her work is that in the 20th century, at least in the Western tradition, there's this total breakdown of both legal and moral norms, right? And we can think of some really prominent examples of that. Arendt, of course, was thinking about totalitarianism in Germany and in Russia.
And I think we can sort of, I think this leads into one of our most interesting and controversial works. But we can be a little bit more specific on this, put more of a finer point on it. That, at least in the United States context, there have been moments when there's been a radical rupture, where it actually became legal. The norm was to be immoral. And examples like that could be the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, where it actually was legal for you to capture a runaway enslaved person and to put them back into the chains of slavery. That was what was legal. That these sort of illegal regimes, what they do is they norm it so that the exception is actually to act morally. Now, Dr. King is referencing in Letter from Birmingham Jail, talking to a bunch of moderate preachers who are upset about Dr. King's propensity to break the law in pursuit of civil rights. And this is where Katie referenced that. He says, there actually is a moral duty to break unjust laws. And I think perhaps the biggest example of the 20th century is the Third Reich of Hitler's Germany, where what Hitler's Germany did is they wanted to make it actually legally sanctioned to murder people. And this is where I think her most controversial work, that's our show and tell. It's perhaps her most controversial book, and it's called Eichmann in Jerusalem. And maybe before I ask you about this work, Katie, a little bit of an introduction to Eichmann. Adolf Eichmann he had a leadership role in the genocide of Jews, but he certainly wasn't the architect. After World War II ends, he escapes to Argentina. He's hiding there in sort of thinly veiled anonymity. And then at the behest of David Ben-Gurion, the prime minister of Israel, he's kidnapped from Argentina and brought back to Israel in the late 50s, early 60s. And there he is tried, and ultimately, spoiler alert, he's executed. Now, this trial, though, Katie, really challenges Arendt's work on the subject of morality and legality. Because, we should say, before we get into that, Arendt went to the trial as a correspondent for the New Yorker magazine. This wasn't the New Yorker's idea. Arendt rubbed her hands together and she's like, dope, I want to go see this trial. I want to see a moral monster. So she convinced the New Yorker to send her to Jerusalem, where she covered the trial, and it lasted a couple of years, right? So I guess, Katie, my question is, how did the trial and the person of Adolf Eichmann, who maybe he didn't kill anybody directly, but he has the blood of millions of people on his hands, how did that trial challenge her thinking and how she conceptualized things like evil and morality and legality?
Yeah, and really good questions. I'm going to try to be careful. Like Kevin said, that this text, Eichmann in Jerusalem, is extraordinarily controversial for a number of reasons that we can go into later. But it really did shake her up, right? Because, and I'll just give you a little anecdote of background a lot of people don't know. The reason why she was so intent to go to Jerusalem and cover this trial, she was living in New York at the time, is because when she was living in France after escaping Germany, she was put in an internment camp in Paris called Gurs, was the name of the camp, and she managed to escape, right? And like only a couple days after her escape, the people, the Jews who were interned in that camp, were transported to the death camps in Germany and Poland and whatnot. And the person who, pardon me, who signed that order was Eichmann. Eichmann was in charge of transportation, of the, the practical.
He's like logistics guy.
Yeah, the logistics of moving these individuals to these death factories, right? And so Arendt knew this. She's very interested to see, like, who is this guy who almost sent me to my death, who sent all these people to their death? And so she says, I expected to be confronted with a monster, right? Because morally, right, when we, think of crimes of this magnitude, we expect wickedness. We expect a kind of demonic presence. How could somebody so evil, what does this person actually look like? Well, what really shook her up is that that's not what she found in Jerusalem. And this is her own conception. It's been challenged in ensuing years. But her takeaway from this, and this is where the famous phrase from that book comes from, this notion of the banality of evil, is this idea that you don't have to be a monster to commit monstrous evil. What that means is what she saw in Eichmann was somebody who, and again, this has been challenged since then, but what she saw was somebody who, wasn't a demon, wasn't wicked, wasn't a monster, wasn't driven by these wicked intentions. He was sort of an ordinary guy who was extraordinarily thoughtless. In the sense that she says, and this I believe is a quote, he never stopped to think about what he was doing, right? He was a bureaucrat who was dealing with these logistics of moving people to the death camps. He never really stopped to think about what that meant.
Was he an anti-Semite? Did he claim to be an anti-Semite?
That's one of the things that's one of the major issues that's contested. Arendt, the evidence that Arendt had access to at the time that she reported on the trial was sort of ambiguous. There were cases in which he helped certain Jewish individuals get off, but then there were other incidents in which he did seem to display anti-Semitic attitudes, which of course most of the population did at that time.
So I guess I'm pressing this because it seems like he's not driven by this kind of like this hatred, this positive evil. He's not like eager to slaughter millions of people on the basis of their religious and ethnic background. It seems like, and at certain points, if I remember in Eichmann, he imagines himself like his conscience is in trouble because he followed what was the law.
Yeah.
He said that it's actually virtuous to follow the law. Like maybe his conscience in that regard is untroubled by the results of his actions, because he thought my role in the Third Reich was to follow the directive of Hitler.
Right. Yeah, and that's where some of this, for us, what we can take away from this, some of this comes from, right? Because for Arendt, and I'll just say something maybe a little bit stronger, which is that for him, yes, it was about following the law, right? And that was sort of his out. That was his way of justifying his actions. But Arendt takes this even further, and she says it's not just that the legal norms in the Third Reich were sort of turned on their head, right? So that, it used to be illegal to commit murder. Now it's legalized and formalized. She says it's also that morality itself was turned on its head. And she talks about how, some of the oldest moral principles in the book, literally, thou shalt not kill, in the Third Reich was transformed into thou shalt kill. Love thy neighbor, report on thy neighbor, right? And so she's seeing an even more profound sort of explosion of traditional social and moral norms, right? And so now she's wondering, and, leading us to wonder, well, if not just the law has been destroyed and overturned, but even our moral laws, our moral traditions have been destroyed and overturned, then how are we supposed to judge right from wrong? And one of, I think, the famous quotes from the book is something like, I wrote it down here because it really struck me. She says, most evil is committed by people who never made up their minds to be either good or bad. Most evil is committed by people who never made up their minds to be either good or bad. They're just sort of going with the flow, right? And that's what she saw in Eichmann. Again, that's been contested with new evidence. But it does, in her mind, create this kernel of an insight, which is that, well, if not just legal norms have been overturned, and it's now actually illegal to do the right thing, but moral norms have been overturned, and so there's this profound confusion about what the right thing to do is, then how are we supposed to be good in this bad society, right? And so that kernel of an idea leads her to try to think about how we can make judgments between right and wrong in the absence of these moral legal standards.
So it seems like, right, she's asking this really important question when there's a collapse of maybe moral principles or reversal and of general legal principles, then it's very difficult to understand what we should do in order to act correctly, what our obligations are as a citizen. And it seems like part of her answer has to do with, like, we have to think in a certain type of way, and part of Eichmann's failure was a failure to think correctly. So I'm wondering, what does she suggest we do in order to think? Is it like looking around at what our peers think? Is it a collaborative sort of activity? Is it independent reflection? How do we know that we're thinking in the right way?
No.
No, like this is the question, right? And it's such a difficult one, in part because as a philosopher, when you raise the question of thinking, what is thinking? That's one of the oldest philosophical questions, goes all the way back to, the ancient Greeks and the pre-Socratics. What is thinking? And so Theo to ask this question, and for Arendt herself to raise this question in this contemporary political context, it's complicated. But I think, when Arendt says Eichmann is evil, and she does believe that he committed great evil, she does believe that he's responsible for what he did and that he should be executed. Her explanation for why he did this stuff is that he exercised a failure to think. And we might say, well, how's that possible? Because, of course, she doesn't mean that he wasn't walking around and, like, having thoughts and daydreams and ideas passing through his head. What she means is something very specific by thinking. And so, and some of the, possibilities that you raised, Theo, is like, how should we know? How should we tell right from wrong? Should we look around at what our peers are thinking and doing? I mean, y'all can tell me what you think about that in the Q&A. But it seems to me that that's a very sort of unreliable way of determining right and wrong, right? Precisely because we're talking about a context in the Third Reich, in Stalinist Russia, in which everybody was thinking the same thing. This was this tremendous amount of conformity of thought and this particular kind of ideological thinking, which led people to the same conclusion and led them to fail to question what they were being told to do. So it can't be that you just kind of look around at what other people are doing. She thinks that thinking, this activity, has the potential to prevent us from doing great evil. What kind of thinking is this? Well, with Eichmann in particular, because she says different things across her different works. With Eichmann in particular, she says that he failed or was unable to think from the perspective of someone else. That's one thing she says about this, right? He doesn't have or doesn't exercise the capacity to think from the position of other people. In other words, he never stopped to think about what his victims were experiencing, right? And what the significance or impact of that might be. Other things she says are, I think, also really important for us. She tells us that we need to stop and think, so we need to pause rather than just rushing into action. You need to stop and take yourself out of the flow of action and really pause to consider. And this mode of considering, she describes as a mode of being in conversation with yourself. And so we've all had this experience in which you're like maybe deliberating about a decision silently in dialogue with yourself in your own head, right? Like, oh, should I do this? Oh, I don't know. If I do this, this will happen, right? And so we have this kind of silent dialogue with ourselves that requires some solitude, some quiet, a pause in the action. We have to stop and think, right? And it's really this activity, this consultation with oneself, which she thinks can prevent great evil. Because what happens in that moment, she thinks, is that, you know, for someone who is contemplating committing an act of evil, whatever that is, murdering somebody, even something like theft, something like that, what she says happens is that, you know, we as individuals need to contemplate whether we are, let's say, content to live with a murderer, content to live with a thief. In other words, content to share your head and your thoughts with somebody who has done this kind of wrong. In other words, to put it even more colloquially, we need to stop to consider whether we'll be able to live with ourselves.
Okay,
Yeah.
like maybe I can follow up on that. This might be the last question, then we'll open it up to the floor. But okay, so we don't want to be, we don't want to live with the murderer in our midst. That sounds right. But if you live under regimes that you find morally repugnant, we'll just use the Third Reich as an example. Then does this kind of moral duty extend to actively breaking the law, or does Arendt talk about maybe the moral duty is just non-compliance? Just, I mean, Eichmann didn't stand up to the Third Reich, but could Eichmann just decided not to follow orders, or are we duty bound to do something greater when we are under unjust regimes? Must we try to break the law actively and maybe sacrifice ourselves and those around us? That seems like a really tall order.
Yeah, and I'm keen to hear folks' thoughts about this because it is complex. For Arendt, so I'll say for Arendt at least, she doesn't seem to think that there is necessarily a moral duty to break an unjust law. And I say that precisely because she has some unanswered questions about the nature of morality, right? She thinks that we live in a world in which moral principles no longer have any meaning, right? And so she is, I think, hesitant to take that step. But she does, and this comes up in the Eichmann trial. Eichmann could have left his position. He could have left his job in the Third Reich and, you know, refused to carry out these orders, right? He, as the trial evidence shows, he wouldn't have been shot. Other people did this, right? Other people left their jobs, were unwilling to cooperate. And he didn't do that, right? He used this cog in the machine defense, right? I was merely a cog. I was merely following orders. But what Arendt says in the Eichmann book is, well, you still have to answer the question, why were you willing to be a cog, right? You're still responsible for that aspect. Why were you willing to participate? Or the word that they use in Germany is coordinate. Why were you willing to be complicit with this program? And so Arendt seems to think that, you know, it's a strong claim to say that you have a moral duty to break the law. But it seems pretty uncontroversial that we might say there's a moral duty to not participate right? She calls this non-participation, to not participate in an unjust or illegal or immoral, rather, program. And, one of the things that she says that has really stuck with me over the years, and she repeats this in several places, she says, the real moral atrocity for her of everything that happened in Germany was not what her enemies did, right? Because she says, it's only natural that a person would have enemies and that they're not going to have your best interests at heart, right? So she wasn't as, let's say, wounded by that. She was extraordinarily wounded, and she located the largest moral atrocity in the actions of her friends, right? She says, what really wounded me were the friends that coordinated, the friends that were complicit, who remained in Germany, who remained in their teaching posts, who remained in their government posts while this was happening. And so maybe we can, she's skeptical about appealing to a higher moral standard, but we can look to, principles of friendship, right? Like, it's immoral to treat your friends in certain ways, right? You have moral responsibilities and obligations to your friends, even if you don't want to take the strong position and say that you have them with respect to everybody. So for her, that was the real moral injury. And so I certainly take a lot from that.
I want to pick up on the point on complicity, but I think we're interested in hearing from you guys. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and then we can kind of just start sort of talking through, pursuing more of these ideas together. Maybe Liam. And how about for folks who are going to come up, maybe you could come and speak because it's being recorded right now.
Is that okay?
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. All right, Liam, what's the question?
What I have here is I'm a United States Marine, and this is my recruit knowledge. So this is what's issued to every Marine going through recruit training. And the very first page is an article of code of conduct written by President Eisenhower.
Ooh.
And I think what was relevant to this would be Article 6. I will never forget that I am an American, fighting for freedom, responsible for my actions, and dedicated to the principles which make my country free. I will trust in my God and in the United States of America. It's focusing basically that no matter what your orders are, you are responsible for what you do. And before you accept that order, you need to be able to justify it with yourself, is how I read it. Would that sort of be the lines of responsibility you put at a person for what Ardit is saying?
Yeah, first I want to thank you so much for that. And I want to ask Kevin a question. Eisenhower, can you give me the years that he...
Yeah, so Eisenhower's president... Go ahead, Liam. You took my U.S. history class.
Well, he issued this order, the executive order, in 1951.
Okay.
President 52 to 60, but what was he before he became president?
He was I think what was like he was a lieutenant at the bonus army raid that MacArthur committed, and he was the only officer to stand against the army. So I think that's an important thing to note about what he intended is, in addition to obviously being a major part of the U.S. military during the war against Germany. I think these are very important and related to the history of it.
Yeah, this is fascinating for me. The reason why I asked when Eisenhower was in power was because, one of the important texts that Arendt writes related to some of these issues is an essay called Civil Disobedience. And she writes it in 1970. I would assume in response to the Kent State shootings, right? So it was at the height of the Vietnam War and the demonstrations against the Vietnam War, right? In which a lot of these questions were very live for people serving in the military during the Vietnam War, right? Is it permissible, first of all, to be a conscientious objector to the war? And then, if you're actually enlisted, do you have a right to let's say, disobey orders that you believe are morally unjust. And so I'm really fascinated that you bring this in. I want to see if Kevin has any,
Yeah, I mean, I
or
think
Theo.
I think that the way I interpret that, Liam, is it seems that one cannot just say and surrender one's moral autonomy because of this larger institution and body. And I think that seems maybe Arendtian to me. Like, one thing I've been thinking about is, like, Arendt at one point in Eichmann says, like, we should judge people who, even under immense pressures, like the Third Reich, where it actually, the exception was to save people's lives, we still should judge them. We can't surrender this kind of moral ground, because if we refuse to judge people, then nobody's guilty. If we don't judge, then, like, everything is permissible. And I think that, what Eisenhower is getting to is this refusal to just kind of surrender to this, because I don't think that can ever be morally permissible. Because there are, to make it not an American case, but like in the Third Reich, there were instances when Germans, there's a guy named like Anton Schmidt, I believe, he broke the law to help Jews, and he was an exception among many. And yet, if we were to just say, no, you have to sort of obey this kind of institutional power, then we surrender, I think, what makes us human, which is the ability to sometimes, we're not automatons. We do have the ability for creative thought, right? Like, if there had been more Anton Schmidts in World War II, it would be a very different story. But to say that, well, it was such incredibly hard times, they couldn't break the law, I think that gives up on what makes us human. And at that point, then we've lost.
That's great that exists in the handbook, as long as it's actually translated into how tribunals proceed and how soldiers are held accountable for actions. But, like, that's great that you brought that up, because I had no clue that existed. I think one thing I want to point out is in Eichmann's position, because a lot of people, I guess, people are, like, tempted to jump to two different, like, oversimplified characterizations of Eichmann. One of them is, like, he was an architect of the Holocaust. He had way more autonomy than he actually did in terms of organizing. And then the other one is to, like, say, like, oh, his position is analogous to that of, like, a soldier who's, like, forced to do commands and can be, like, potentially liable to lose his life for violating orders. And, like, Eichmann wasn't in that position at all. Like, he could have left. And it's really interesting because in the book, what Arendt is mostly critiquing is not the people who are doing the actual killing, although she does, like, draw attention to it. It's all of the, like, middle chain of command that's necessary to conduct something like a genocide on an entire continent, right? And so she's like, it's all of these middle positions where people aren't held account or, like, liable to lose their life if they resist, where people just unthinkingly, like, went on. Or even, like, in the case of Eichmann, when he was first acting in his office to coordinate transit, he knew that he was forcibly deporting Jews, but he didn't know that he was sending them to death, because they weren't being sent to death at that point. Then the regime shifted their, I guess, method, and then concentration camps started becoming killing centers. And Eichmann became, like, he was made aware of this. He had to visit several of them. He witnessed what was going on. He was made sick by it. But then he still resolved himself to stay in this role where he would still have his life and his safety if he left. So I think it's really interesting. Like, it's great that there's that for those, right, like, more, like, direct roles, but especially the middle roles, I think, is where we need to focus right on that. Yeah.
I was interested to note that one thing I was talking about was probably like one of those myth, like, not a real quote, but it's the message behind it that matters, and it was, I forget the name of the general that came, the German general that came and trained the U.S. troops at Valley Forge, but he was supposedly complaining to Washington about how you tell a German soldier to do something, he does it. You tell an American soldier to do something, he asks why. Washington supposedly said, that's what I like about American soldiers. And also, there was the story of the St. Patrick's Battalion in the Mexican-American War, where an entire battalion of Catholic troops basically went and joined the Mexican side, not saying we support Mexico, but we are going to defend our Catholic churches from the burning and the slaughtering of the churches themselves. Saying that they died to a man. So that, there's no excuse. It's sort of how I do it.
Good.
Thanks. we saw any other, I think we saw another question. Nafis.
So, I went on a little bit of a rabbit hole deep dive on Arendt last night, and
I've been there.
in the beginning was she had criticisms of Zionism.
Yeah.
Given the current Israel-Palestine conflict, which some academic scholars have classified as like a genocide, kind of reading through her works, it seems like some people classify her as like anti-Zionist, while others say like it's actually her views are a lot more complex. So in light of kind of what's happening in that region of the Middle East right now, given the state of Israel, they do have mandatory conscription for their citizens, like everyone's required to serve. So would the moral imperative, according to Arendt, like let's say, would it be morally just for someone, as some Israeli citizens have refused that military service and have been imprisoned, whereas others have served, but they later, there's an Israeli organization called Breaking the Silence, which consists of former IDF soldiers who are basically, talking about the human injustice the IDF has committed. And so, like, what would be like? Because as a person, I'm thinking it makes sense someone chooses not to participate in an imperialistic organization like the IDF, but on the other hand, someone who's participated but perhaps has been allowed to minimize some harms, like working within the system. So, like, is there like one or the other, or is there room for like a gray area in something like in that context?
That's such a good question. So I'll start by just speaking to Arendt's, I guess, own views on Zionism. I think on my reading, what is a little bit complex about her views is just temporally how they played out, right? And so in the 30s, up to the early 40s, she was sort of involved in Zionist organizations as, and she said at the time, they were the only Jewish organizations that were like seriously resisting what was happening. So she was doing some work with them. But in 1944, I believe, she writes an essay called Zionism Reconsidered, and then some other essays subsequent to that, in which it's pretty clear that she has turned away from Zionism, right? She was never officially a Zionist, but it was in that essay that she really critiques Zionism very strongly, which is sort of characteristic of her thinking. She never goes halfway on something, which is part of the reason why she's been controversial. So her own view for a number of different reasons was that Zionism is a mistake pragmatically and in other ways. The question of, is Israeli citizens and what, if we want to use the language of moral duty, like what their duty is a really interesting one. And I'm trying to think through it because part of what, as you framed it, the issue is, do I exercise non-participation, so remove myself from a system that I have judged to be unjust? And as you said, a number of Israeli citizens have done that and continue to do that and receive jail time. Or do I try to change things from the inside, which of course has been the desire and maybe the conceit of people in all kinds of unjust systems, right? They think, I've known plenty of people in my life who say things like this about, the police or the military or the whatever the case may be. And it's a difficult question. Arendt does speak about this in the essay I mentioned, Civil Disobedience, in which she suggests that trying to change things from the inside is only effective up to a point, right? And she doesn't really spell out what that point is. I think from my perspective, speaking on Arendt's point of view, she's more interested in non-participation as an act of civil disobedience, right? Whereas, if you participate in a system, you tacitly consent to it, right? And you might try to change things from the inside, but you haven't registered your dissent in some important way.
Yeah, I think if I could pick up on
Please.
that, I think there's a sense that Arendt wants to make a distinction between what is useless and what is meaningful, and the idea that what's the point? I might as well be complicit, because there's really no, I'm not going to gain anything immediately if I try to even just kind of go against it. So there's no sense that you might as well do that and try to live a life of virtue that way. And I think Arendt would say, no, there's no such thing as being practically useless, because in the long run, I think generally, maybe here when we're wondering how many regime I don't I think Arendt would say complicity is a moral harm. And even if you think that to resist is useless, there's still a meaning behind that. And that meaning is really, really important, because it allows us to remember that we still have the ability as human beings to resist. There's a book called Life and Fate by Vasily Grossman. I don't know if you guys ever read that. No. It's War and Peace for the 20th Century. It's fantastic. And it's this giant historical epic set in World War II. And it's what Grossman wants to carve out a space for is what he calls irrational kindness, where at the end of the Battle of Stalingrad, there's this German soldier who's captured. And he's surrounded by a bunch of angry Russians who are you destroyed our country, we want vengeance. And there's this Russian woman who comes into the middle of this mob and hands the German soldier a loaf of bread. And it's the soldier was going to be killed afterwards anyway. But it made no sense for that Russian woman to do it. But it was just irrational kindness. And for Grossman, there was this sense that no, you can try to stamp out via totalitarianism, via regimes that are unjust, via a government that's going to try to force you to do something that is, you think, morally repugnant. There needs to be that space for you to still have the kind of humanity, this kind of creative act that doesn't make sense. So this is a long way of saying, I think Arendt would say, I think non-compliance is your moral duty if you find that to be what is compelled by one's membership in the human species.
Also, one thing that I think maybe it seemed like you were suggesting that I think Arendt would take a hard line against is this idea of internal emigration, I think is what she calls it.
Yeah,
it was a really common defense amongst Nazis during the Nuremberg trials, where basically they were well, I just couldn't do anything else. So in my mind, I still understood that it was wrong, and I all of these things that I was doing were horrible, but I still did it. And so internally, I was reserving this sort of moral disdain, but I was still doing it. And so maybe in the case that you were talking about, where it's an IDF soldier who's well, I'm going along with this, but then afterwards I will maybe be a whistleblower or something like that. I think Arendt might treat it as that sort of thing. If you're being complicit in any role that's analogous, right? You're being complicit, but internally you disagree. That's effectively worthless.
Thanks.
Thank you.
We have a few questions. Ella and then Renee, why don't you come on down?
Just give us a second. Technical difficulties.
We have another. Yeah, that we haven't.
No, the camera died.
It's not a camera. Well, Ella, while we're technical difficulties, ask the question.
My question is, would you say it's fair to say that people who... Can I repeat it?
Yes.
Okay. So my question is, would you say it's fair to say that people who blindly conform to immoral rules or laws should be held accountable to the same standard as, let's say, people who are creating the systems, who say these or implement these rules or laws?
So that's such a good question. I'll just start again. Partly the role that I've given myself is Arendt's mouthpiece.
And we can. And
It's
we,
by the way, like I don't think that was a sign.
no, it wasn't. As I said, I've taken it upon myself, and which we should feel free to criticize Arendt on her views. She seems to think that that morally we might hold them in different regard. We might have different standards. Legally, we need our justice system, our legal system. Is not its job is not to weigh in on people's intentions or people's motivations, but rather to judge what they did, right? To take to judge their conduct, to judge their deeds. And so if we're saying, for instance, that these, let's say, two people have done the same deed, they should receive the same punishment. System should be morally, we might make distinctions. But what do y'all think of that?
Wait, I have one point, and maybe it'll help in general. So one thing that's really interesting is that Eichmann's plea in the case was against the advice of his legal counsel, and it was not guilty in the sense of the indictment. And it seems like one of the things he meant by that is that he believed himself to be an accessory to genocide rather than a perpetrator of genocide. But it seems like the trial rightfully declared that he was a perpetrator of genocide, because in crimes like that, if you're a central participant, even if you're not the top, you're still playing a central role that is necessary to execute the crime that's being done. And so I think that's a really good legal, another thing too is if Eichmann was directing trains without the knowledge of where these trains were going, that might be a different story. But they, one of the central goals of his, preliminary, what was it? Just talks with the police chief. Yeah, interviews. Was to establish his knowledge of what he was doing. And he had full knowledge of where he was sending people and what would happen to them, even though he didn't know who specifically it would happen to. And that seems to be another really important part in establishing the legal guilds.
Yeah, I think morally it does matter. One thing that, this is more of an origins point, one of the things that Arendt's really worried about is sometimes these regimes can, not only do they create a system, they create a culture of, which he calls a culture of mendacity, of lying about stuff. So I think what to say that one who is creating a system but also a culture around it, even though they're not doing it directly, I think then that is absolutely morally punishable. Yes.
Yeah, it's almost inverted. It's like the higher up you are, the more morally culpable you are. But the lower down you are, the more likely you're actually carrying out these murders, these crimes, and so the more legally culpable you are in that restriction. Yeah, but you put your finger on on a very interesting central issue here. Thank you.
It is of my belief to say that a lot of how this form of or act of rebellion, in order for rebellion to breed, you need to be aware. You need to be aware that there are indeed other options here, and one way I believe that conformity to these systems are formed is through isolation, either not just physical isolation, cultural isolation. And of course, I think we can see that quite clearly through Nazi Germany, how it started to form. Germany was very oppressed at this time. The population was very angry because they were under heavy reparations, yes. And culturally, they were also isolated because we just lost the war. We're getting heavily fined. We're getting heavily fined here. What are we doing? We're trying to find a solution. And what I'm wondering is, I think this is not to say a counterpoint, but another perspective here is, Nazi Germany, they did a lot for their people to go ahead and make them feel a lot more comfortable. and they were isolated in that regard, despite knowing that they were, especially for in the case of, oh, sorry, what's his name again? Eichmann. Despite knowing that in the case of Eichmann, there's that even though as he knew that there were probably other options that he could quit but didn't. I'm wondering how far this conformity goes. Is there a space for, especially for cultural isolation and conformity, if you were not to know anything, or if you were not to know anything else, how far realistically could someone go? How far realistically could someone go into rebellion despite not knowing and being, again, culturally isolated, being unaware of these other ideas, despite having that capacity as a human?
Thanks, Renee. And I think we can answer that in maybe like a couple minutes, and then we can continue the conversation.
Thank you.
Start?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think it gets at something, how we haven't quite talked about, but I think is really relevant to today, which is something Arendt discusses in one of her other books, The Origins of Totalitarianism. She does believe that Nazi Germany was a totalitarian state, and part of what that meant for her is that conformity was enforced through terror, right? And among other things, what that created was profound isolation, not just from the rest of the world, but individual citizens from each other, right? Everybody's like kind of worried about what other people are doing. Am I going to be reported on? It's maybe more the case in the Russian case, right? But it creates this profound isolation and what she calls loneliness, right? This inability not only to see other options, but even to believe in the possibility of other ways of thinking. And this is part of the ideological thinking that takes over totalitarian regimes. And so I think it's a genuine concern of hers. To what extent was it really possible to think outside of the box here?
I'll add like another concern of hers, especially like in the human condition, is she talks about what breeds thoughtlessness, and she was so worried about like automation, the fact that automation leads people to just have what are traditionally the way we think and we act is just done by a machine. And I think we can add that now to like AI. I think we can add that now to like any sort of thing that renders other human beings superfluous and renders our active thinking superfluous as well. You can just plug in. And Arendt was scandalized by this and terrified. So I think coupled with sort of the loneliness, the epidemic of loneliness, I think one thing she would worry about is that the fact that so much of what we do now, whether it's AI writing our papers, which is what we're upset about up here.
Nobody in here is.
Nobody does that.
Certainly.
Nobody. But it just like there are these cultural trends towards not thinking, not taking ownership over your thought. And it's that, I think she argues, that is as greater cause for any sort of totalitarianism, rather than like active evil. It's that kind of thoughtlessness that breeds banality, that breeds tragedy.
Maybe as a final point, you brought up like a really important general philosophical question, which is like, what is the relationship between knowledge and morality? Seems like there is at least some connection, like very plausibly. You need to know certain things in order to act morally. There's a question about what that is. One of it might be like, one of the things you might need to know is like possible alternative actions. Then there's like another question, which is like, can you be guilty of your own ignorance? And there's cases where it's not clear. Maybe there's no other action that you could have taken and you're just like restricted from getting this information. And in that case, it doesn't seem like you're guilty of your own ignorance. You're forced into it. But I think a lot of the times, probably relevantly like for us right now, we're guilty of our own ignorance a lot of the time in that like we can see alternative possibilities, but a lot of the time, like out of laziness, overwhelm, we ignore them. I can't speak for Nazi Germany because I was not there and I'm not a historian, but at least connecting it to the modern day.
Thanks for that question. Yeah. So first, I'm many kilometer plus that can Thank you for the great questions, like really good questions. We could keep going for hours. Like y'all got class.